Hello, friends, and welcome to a Chabura Public Shiur. We are excited to be partnering today with the Sephardic Jewish Brotherhood of America for a two-part series exploring the Sephardic Chief Rabbis of America. Leading our exploration is a dear friend and first-time Chabura speaker, Ethan Marcus. About our speaker, Ethan Marcus is Managing Director of the Sephardic Jewish Brotherhood of America, where he expands engagement among Ladino-speaking Sephardic Jews. A former Fulbright scholar and Princeton graduate, he has led community initiatives in Seattle and researched Romanite liturgy in Greece. His roots trace to Vieira and Izmir. It is a privilege to have him with us. I also recommend everyone check out the Sephardic Jewish Brotherhood and the wonderful work they do in supporting and caring for the Sephardic tradition and community. Thank you all who are here live with us. It's nice to see some new faces. Thank you all to those who will be listening after. And Ethan, it is an honor, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for that very flattering introduction, Ohad. It's great to be here. I want to really thank the Habura and the entire team, Ohad, obviously, but also Avi and Sina and everybody else involved for all the incredible work you all do. Hazakim u'burachim, as we say. So let me just share my little presentation here. Everybody can see? Yeah? Thumbs up, Ohad?
Yes,
okay,
sir.
great. Wonderful. So this series, I'm very excited about. This is the first time I'm really presenting about these two individuals, exploring the Sephardic Chief Rabbis America. Is very exciting because these are two unknown Chachamim who are my inspiration, and in many ways should be your inspiration as well, if you truly care about the Sephardi way, right? The approach of worldliness, but being steeped in one's tradition. And these are unknown Chachamim in many ways, unfortunately. But today we're changing that, of course. So part one, we're focusing on Rabbi Dr. Nissim J. Ovadia. But before we jump in to the character of him and who he was, we need to take a step back first and talk about who we're talking about in this context. You know, the question of what is a Sephardic Jew obviously can be a charged one in many ways, certainly one that depends on how you identify Sephardic Jew, what your definition is, etc. So for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to refer to two definitions. One from Professor Dr. Dina Danon from the University of Binghamton, who's an expert on Sephardic Jewry from the Eastern Mediterranean basin, places like Turkey and Greece, the Balkans. And she notes that sometimes Sephardic and Mizrahi refers to two different groups, but sometimes as well, they can be the same thing, right? Despite the divergences in location, despite the divergences in even history and minhag, Sephardic can often be a catch-all for any Jew who did not come from the Ashkenazi world, right? Those Jews who, as far as, you know, anywhere from Morocco all the way to Bukharia and Central Asia, a very broad swath is often lumped into this group. And even to focus on a more narrow definition for today's talk, and this is in no way dismissive of anyone's history or identity, we're going to focus on a specific community. Those are the Greek Jews, Balkan Sephardim, those who typically, historically, less than 100 years ago, referred to principally as Sephardim. So we term this term Sephardim from basically anyone who really came directly from Spain and Portugal, right? The Iberian Peninsula after the expulsion, either went two routes, either to places like Amsterdam and London, right? The Spanish and Portuguese communities, and eventually to New York in 1654, or the Eastern Ottoman Empire, right? Places like I mentioned, Western Turkey, what's today Greece, the Balkans, places like Sarajevo, even places like Egypt. There were Ladino-speaking communities. And for, again, this talk, we're really talking about the Ladino-speaking Jews, Jews who spoke Judeo-Spanish. And you can see, you know, this famous map. I'm sure everybody's seen before. I'm sorry for the low res. You can just see the path I mentioned, right? So the Spanish and Portuguese Western Sephardim, who went from Spain and Portugal to Amsterdam and eventually to London, some to Hamburg in France. And then the Eastern Sephardim, some did go to North Africa, right? Spanish Morocco and Tetuan and Tangier, for example, spoke Akatia. And those who went to Italy and eventually ended up in the Ottoman lands, places like Istanbul, like Salonika, like Belgrade, etc. So we're really focusing on that community today. So just to highlight some of these hubs and why this is so important, let's get in context here. The first Jews to arrive in America came in 1654. As I mentioned, Spanish and Portuguese Jews who went from Amsterdam to London, Recife, Brazil, and eventually arrived in New York, formed Congregation Shereth Israel, still today in existence, still the oldest congregation in America. Those were predominantly Portuguese-speaking Jews, right? And by the time they established themselves over hundreds of years, They already become English-speaking Jews. They become American Jews, right? Very different from the Jewish communities I'm talking about today, who start principally arriving in America late 1890s, 1900, around this period of time, during the great wave of migrations from Europe to the United States, and also England, by the way. Actually, there are several communities that are established, small ones, particularly notable Holland Park Synagogue, still exists today. It was established by Salonican and Izmir Jews. But I want to highlight these cities because this is very important when talking about Rabbi Nissim Ovadia later on. Each community in the Ottoman Empire, broadly speaking, had quasi-independence because they were under something called the millet system, which basically means that as long as you paid the jizya, the community Jewish tax of the dini, right, the second-class status, you obeyed the state law, and you didn't cause trouble, you were left alone to self-govern. So a community like Salonika, famous Salonika, for example, would govern itself, meaning the Ottoman authorities would let the community have its own autonomy. They would elect their own officers, presidents, rabbis, etc., for a community structure, and their Bet Din, their court, would be the court of the state. So, for example, if you had a dispute, let's say a commercial dispute, or even a criminal dispute between you and another Jew, you would not go to the civil court, because there was actually no civil court. The civil court was a Muslim court, through an imam. You would go to the Bet Din. And if the Bet Din ruled against you, tough luck, because that is power of the state. So if, let's say, the Bet Din ruled you owed such and such a man or woman 1,000 lira, you had to pay. And if you didn't pay, the Bet Din could issue then an order to the local Muslim authorities, the political authorities, to arrest you and hold you in contempt of the court. This is just an example of why this kind of self-identity and autonomy is so critical. Each community really identified with the city they were from. This is really important because when these Jews relocate to the New World, to America, they continue that association. They move together as a group, right? So, for example, at the turn of the century, in the 1920, 1910, around there, by the time these communities start to form, start to discuss ideas in forming an American identity, there's something like 20 or 30 societies already, typically mutual aid societies, that help these Jews establish themselves, give them night classes in English, immigration support, right? This is a time before social welfare in America really established itself. There was no Social Security, no medical coverage, no Medicaid or state welfare. So these societies were really your go-to. And of course, you went to where you were from, right? If you knew there was a synagogue or a mutual aid society from the town, let's say, of Monastir in New York, you'd go there, right? But this took time, obviously, to establish. But you would only identify with that town. You wouldn't necessarily identify as this pan-Sephardic cultural umbrella. That comes much later, and that partially because of the difficulty, and I would say in many ways, we say in Ladino, cabeza dura, the hard-headedness, the stubbornness often our communities would face when dealing with this. I also want to mention some important factors that come into play here when talking about the Ladino-speaking community. Thank God, unlike many broader, let's say, pan-Sephardic communities from North Africa or the Middle East or even Central Asia, those communities did not experience the Shoah in its full force. Unfortunately, many communities from the Ladino-speaking world, did. Right? Famously, Greece had the highest percentage loss of any officially occupied country during the war. Nearly 89% of the Jewish communities of Greece were devastated. Famously, Salonika, once called La Madre de Israel, the mother of Israel, or the Jerusalem of the Balkans. Over 50,000 Jews, by the time World War II occurred, lost nearly 48,000 Jews, less than 2,000 returned. The center of learning, culture, dozens of yeshivot, 50 synagogues, the community baked in, teshuvot. I mean, a massive, massive powerhouse. It's you can do a whole multiple series just on Salonika and its history and its facts. It was devastated. And there are essentially three factors that affects our Ladino-speaking community in America that Rabbi Nissim Ovadia tries to address, right? One is this brutal loss that we face in the Holocaust, in the Shoah. Two, the issue of assimilation in America, coming to America, becoming American Jews, right? And a lack of institutional structure in America. There's no really yeshivot for Sephardim when these Sephardic Jews coming at the turn of the 20th century. And three, discrimination, which I'll get to in a moment, that our Sephardic Jews were essentially the first wave, and soon after followed Syrian Jews from places like Damascus and Aleppo, and even some Yemenite Jews in the 30s to America. But our community was the first to face this kind of discrimination from the Ashkenazi peers. So where do they go? They go to New York's Lower East Side, right? Classic port of call for all immigrant communities, right? So it's a crowded place, as many of you may know. It's a difficult place. I believe it's like London's West End, I believe, was an immigrant community, immigrant hub. And this is where Ashkenazim, Sephardim, Italian Americans, Irish Americans, first generation Americans go. It's a difficult place. And they're going at a time when Ashkenazim are also traveling, also coming from Russia, from Poland, albeit in larger numbers. And people ask, why were the Ottoman Jews leaving at this time? Were they leaving because of persecution? Excuse me, London East Side. Thank you for the correction. Generally, they were not actually leaving for persecution. Most Ottoman Sephardim were leaving the Ottoman Empire because of the Balkan, First and Second Balkan Wars, so a lot of instability through the Young Turk Revolution. And also, frankly, it's the first time after 1904 that young men are required to draft into the army, young Jewish men. It's the first time. So that makes a big push for a lot of young 16, 17, 18-year-old teenagers to come to America. And generally speaking, people want to look for new economic opportunity. The Ottoman Empire was crumbling, the writing was on the wall. So they come to New York principally, but they come to other major hubs, Philadelphia, Atlanta, Georgia, Seattle, Washington, Portland, Oregon, across the country. But they come to these communities and they're not really accepted by the local Jewish population. And I'll tell you what I mean. We know the stories, of course, of discrimination of Sephardim in Israel, certainly, and other communities around the world. But I want to highlight one story, for example. So there's a gentleman who's a founder of my organization, the Sephardic Brotherhood of America, one of our pinnacle leaders. He immigrates to New York in 1920, comes from Istanbul. That's his home. That was his place. He was very well educated. He takes law. He studies law at the University of Istanbul. And if anybody knows, at the time, in 1920, the University of Istanbul was a very prestigious community. Prestigious university, right? It's a place where Ben Gurion famously actually studied for laws before he goes to Israel and studies and becomes a global hub. So he's well educated. He speaks 5 languages: French, Italian, Spanish, Turkish, whatever, etc. So he speaks multiple languages, comes to New York. He says, tell me where the Jews are. He gets off the boat. If you tell me where the Jews are, I'll figure it out. They'll help me. So where does he go? Goes to the Lower East Side. He finds the Jewish boarding house. This story is recorded in the Library of Congress, by the way, so you can look it up afterwards as well. He goes to the Jewish boarding house. He says, I'd like a room, please. I'm Jewish, I need to set myself up. The Jewish boarder says, you're Jewish with like a motto? I don't believe you. He says, of course I'm Jewish. He says, no, you have dark skin. Do you speak Yiddish? He said, no, I don't speak Yiddish. He's like, how can you be Jewish and not speak Yiddish? Right? Classic story. He says, I'll prove it to you. So he takes out his siddur. He starts reading Tefillah, Shemona Esrei, Shema. He takes out his talit and tefillin, shows the man. The guy says, no, this is ridiculous. You have dark skin. You're quote unquote swarthy. He uses that word, which is a very derogatory word, and says, I don't believe you. He finally says, come in the back. He pulls him in the back. He says, drop your pants. He makes him show his Brit Milah, and he says to him, no, I still don't believe you. You must be a Mohammedan, Muslim, or a gringo, a Mexican. Get out. And he throws him out. But this is real, right? This is not a fake thing. This is one, albeit a very extreme example, but a serious one of the type of discrimination Sephardim are facing. And you see these kind of articles pop up, like this one over here I found about the type of Oriental Jew who speaks the strange language Ladino, a recent bride of the strange Ladinos, right? So you have this kind of othering of these people. And there's these great articles that are coming, not great, but great resources that are coming out just to why Rabbi Nissim Ovadia got into this and what's happening here that are very narrative. So here's an example. Who are these strangers who can be seen in the ghetto of the Lower East Side, sitting outside coffee houses, smoking strange-looking water pipes? They mean hookah, sipping a dark liquid from tiny cups, they mean coffee, and playing a game of checkers and dice, a game that we're not familiar with. We're talking about sheshbes, we're talking about, backgammon. See the signs of these institutions. They read Cafe Constantinopoli, Cafe Oriental, Cafe Smyrna, and there are other signs in Hebrew characters that you perhaps cannot read. Are they Jews? No, it cannot be. They do not look like Jews. They do not speak Yiddish. Listen, what is that strange tongue they are using? It sounds like Spanish or Mexican. Are they Spaniards or Mexicans? If so, where did they get the coffee houses and import from Greece and Turkey? I should mention at this time when these Sephardim come, they feel othered. So they start doing what is very natural to them. They open up coffee houses and local establishments as places to hang out, to learn, as important social hubs for the day. But the Ashkenazim don't know what to do with these people. They look at them like they're crazy, like, who are these guys? What are they doing here? And I'll tell you something else, that there are many, many highlights and examples of this. One quote I love to cite as well from this gentleman named Joseph Gedalicia, who was a leader in the community at the time, very famous leader, very proud leader of the community. He mentions that the tragedy of the Spanish Sephardic Jews in America is that we can't speak Yiddish. A few speak ancient Hebrew. As you know, there is not the common language of the Lower East Side of New York. We are strangers among our people. A great many European Jews would not believe we're even members of the Hebrew nation. And this really bites us in the butt, right? When we try to go to Jewish community institutions, the local federation, the local yeshivot, they throw us out. They don't even welcome us. There's another great story I quote. This is from Gedalicia. He experiences this when he first comes to America. He quotes it. The Russian Jew swore that the other Sephardic men did not keep the fast. He declared that the other was not even a Jew. He laughed blusterously, deridingly. The other was a Greek, a Turk, an Italian. He was either a Mohammedan, Muslim, or a Christian. He was a Gentile. He was no Jew. The scene became hysterical. The man from Constantinople wept. Gedalicia. He shouted. He appealed to his forefathers, including Abraham. It was monstrous that the serf from Russia did not know him to be a Jew. You would eat pork, said the Russian Jew. The irony of the situation is that Gedalicia gets so pissed off by this statement, he beats him. He beats him in the middle of the street. It's so crazy. And then the guy responds later on, okay, I believe you're Jewish. You definitely come from the Maccabees. Like, for sure you have the strings of the Maccabees. So it's like, it's hilarious, right? That it took a beating to convince this guy he was Jewish, right? And this comes out throughout the communities. This came out, the Jewish Forward famously published these articles that were critical even to the 1950s. Like this thing, like the swarthy skin, the strange language, the funny pronunciation of Lashon Kodesh, as the Ashkenazim would probably say at the time, right? And their names are strange. So all this is to set the stage for our main character, Rabbi Dr. Nissim Yosef Ovadia, and his importance at this time, right? So a little bit about Rabbi Nissim Ovadia, who I'll mention is really my personal hero and North Star for the work we're doing for the Sephardic community today. So Rabbi Nissim Ovadia was born in Adrianople, which is today Edirne in modern Turkey. If you can think of a map, actually I can even show you if we go back just a little bit. So Edirne here's Istanbul. Edirne is right over here on the border with Bulgaria and modern Greece, right? So it's a European side Turkey, right? So it's a little more European influence. So he's born there in 1890 to a long storied rabbinical family, right? And he attends the Alliance Israélite Universelle. So if people don't know, this was a critical institution in the Ottoman Empire, starting from the 1870s all the way through the 1940s and 50s. So this institution from Paris, established after the emancipation of French Jews, and the secularization of French Jews, is basically established to create Jewish schools throughout all of the Ottoman lands as a way to Westernize or Europeanize Ottoman Sephardic Jewry. And this happens also in North Africa as well. Morocco gets them, Algeria, Tunisia. And the importance to note about these institutions that they were all conducted in French, right? Teach the French language. That's why French becomes so prominent among our community, indigenous in Ladino. They're also about creating a more Western educational focus, so less spent on the traditional yeshivot, which they clash with local rabbis quite a bit. Salonika, in Istanbul and Izmir, in Morocco, we see evidence of them clashing with these rabbis. But he goes there because it's a free school, right? This is really critical at a time when the Ottoman Empire is crumbling. Jews don't have so much wealth. So he goes there, and later to Yeshiva in Jerusalem. He goes to Bet Midrash, the Rabbanim Shel Heftash Ezra, long name, but it was under the auspices of his teacher, Rabbi Ben Zion Uziel, who, again, another great gadol of our communities, who I'm sure you've seen from previous haburas, later becomes the chief rabbi of mandatory Palestine, and then the first Sephardic chief rabbi of the state of Israel. So already you can start seeing where he's learning from, right? He's pulling it from his own family, he's pulling it from the school, so he's getting a Western education, but also an Eastern education, Eastern, I would say, traditional education from people like Rabbi Nissim, Rabbi Uziel, right, who is a Jew, comes from that Middle Eastern milieu. And he's getting that thing. So he's straddling both worlds. In 1915, he goes to Vienna, and he becomes the assistant rabbi of the Turkish temple, which is the Sephardic synagogue of the city. So by now, when we talk about, it's important to say, when we talk about Sephardim in Europe, places like France, places like Austria, places like Germany, we're not talking about the same Sephardic communities that are there today, right? It's very important to notice that, right? So like today in France, the vast majority of Jews who are of Sephardic descent come from Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, right? Who immigrated sort of in the 50s and 60s after the collapse of the French control in North Africa. We're talking about a entirely different community. These were mostly Jews who moved for economic opportunity for places like Salonika, places like Izmir, places like Sarajevo, Ladino-speaking Jews. To places like France, Vienna, even Barcelona and Madrid, they were some of the first Jews to return to Spain that are establishing themselves in business, in community, etc. So Vienna is one of those communities. It's established itself about 1890s or so. They built a gorgeous, gorgeous synagogue, and they have a chief rabbi. So Rabbi Nissim Ovadia goes there to become the assistant rabbi. And while he's there, he receives his PhD in 1920, I believe in Doctor of Philosophy from the University of Vienna, very prestigious. And throughout this period of time, from the 1920s and 30s, which we'll see in a moment, he really becomes a critical voice in global Sephardic Jewry, and global Jewry in general, right? This is the heyday of the Zionist movement, right? Herzl already launched the first Zionist Congress. We have fierce debates in the 20s and 30s across hubs in Europe, like Vienna, being one of the major hubs of Zionism and Zionist debate about the future of world Jewry, the future of the Jewish state, etc. And he becomes very involved, later establishing the World Sephardic Federation and serving on the Jewish Agency Executive Committee. And then later he moves to Paris in the 1930s. So we're going to touch all of this. So I mentioned, he's the international Sephardi, so to speak. He helps when he's in Vienna to form the first ever World Sephardic Congress, the first convening of Sephardic community institutions outside of the land of Israel. It's really an extraordinary thing. They bring people from Paris, from London, from Spain, even from the United States and Canada. Famously, Rabbi Dr. Poole gets involved, Henry Prior Mendes gets involved. And you can see these are some meetings, if you see in the background, if anybody notices, this is actually a synagogue in Amsterdam, when they meet in Amsterdam later on. But in the first meeting in Vienna, they basically recognize the need for this global institution with the principal goal to build a yeshiva, build a yeshiva in Yerushalayim that will educate rabbis for communities around the world. And this is not done before, at least in a formal organized capacity. And he is an ardent organizer. He is what you would call the chief community organizer in many ways. He is arguing constantly with delegates, trying to organize the communities, right? So he's doing this while in Vienna. He later goes from the assistant rabbi to then the chief rabbi of Vienna. He spends about 16 years there. And then he goes to Paris. By the way, I just want to note these photos. It's very interesting to see who was at these conferences. This is the second conference. I believe this one is in Paris in 1935. Notice the people in the room. You have Rabbi Dr. Nissim Ovadia here. But you also have people like Shem Tom Gagin, who is the Chacham of the S&P Sephardic community in London, the Commonwealth. You have people like, I believe, Raphael Montefiore, who's a descendant of Sir Moses Montefiore, right there to help organize this. This was a big deal. And the Sephardim recognize that they are losing the war, they're losing the battle to preserve their identity and culture. That's why they're convening these conferences. So I want to mention things about his leadership as well when he gets to Paris. When he gets to Paris in the early 1930s, the community is a mess. You have so much infighting. Remember I mentioned that in Ottoman lands, Sephardim really identified with their community of origin, right? Salonika or Izmir, Istanbul. And I heard an anecdote once from when I visited the Holland Park Synagogue for Rosh Hashanah a few years ago, that the Jews from Salonika would sit on this side of the room, the Jews of Istanbul would sit on this side of the room, and they would shout at across the synagogue during tefillah, no, that's not how we did in Salonika. No, it's this way in Istanbul. Back and forth between the competing minhagim. It's a very classic thing. I'm sure other Sephardim know this from other communities. We all kind of struggle with this internal battle. So in Paris, he gets there. A community is in disarray. There's 3 different synagogues. They're all fighting. None of them can really sustain to pay a full-time rabbi. They have multiple schools. They're not respected by the Ashkenazi peers. It's a bit of a mess. And he gets right to work. He is so persuasive of the leadership that he actually gets them to consolidate into one synagogue, which is pretty extraordinary of a feat. So they consolidated to build this beautiful Don Yitzhak Abravanel synagogue that is located, I believe, in the 17th arrondissement in Paris. They centralize the yeshiva, the school for the community, and they really create a cohesive community, one that has a chief rabbi, that is him, one that is educating its youth, and one that is serving the populace. And during this time, he's not just focusing on Paris. Again, he's doing global stuff. He writes multiple sidurim and machzorim. He edits them first from his predecessor, Dr. Papel, who was in Vienna, and then he publishes himself. And his goal, he recognizes, which is really critical, is that our people aren't learning anymore. They're not practicing the minhagim because we're not teaching them minhag. We're not teaching them even just to read Torah. And we're not teaching them easy commentaries so they understand the purpose of tefillah. So he creates this beautiful machzorim in Hebrew and Ladino, because Ladino is still very much the lingua franca by many, with commentary on the tefillah. Why do we do this? Why do we do that? I mean, it's pretty forward thinking if you think about it, because at this time, no one's really creating sidurim that have commentary on the meaning behind tefillah. Like even the famous Disolopol Sidur, which comes out in the 40s from the United States, it's a beautiful Sidur, but it doesn't have commentary. It doesn't guide people on the meaning of tefillah. So fast forward a little bit, we get to Paris, 1940, World War II. Paris obviously falls, but 6 weeks after the start of World War II, unfortunately. And Rabbi Nissim Ovadia is left with kind of this critical choice. He refuses to leave Paris. It's extraordinary. So Paris opens, becomes a free city. The Jews are trying to flee, get out as quickly as they can, try to at least escape to Vichy, France in the south. But he refuses to leave. He's a very public figure. He has very good relationships with the Catholic Church, with the local municipality. And the Nazis are coming. The Nazis come. They occupy Paris. And he basically gets wind from a friend of his, who is a Catholic bishop, saying that the Nazi Gestapo are coming for you. You need to get out now. You need to leave. And unfortunately, he grapples with this decision very, very difficultly, because he is someone who doesn't leave his community and doesn't like the idea of leaving his community, especially when they're under threat like this crisis. But ultimately, he leaves. He leaves because he's pushed by the bishop, that they will kill you. There's a warrant for your arrest. They're planning to hang you. So he leaves with his wife and 2 sons. They flee in the night. They flee through the south of France, through Vichy, France. And there's an apocryphal story. We don't know if it's true or not, but it's still, I think, relevant to show who he was as a person. He was a huge bibliophile. He had this massive library he brought with him from Vienna to Paris, and he had to leave it behind. He was so devastated by this loss, and just devastated by the situation, obviously. So they're in the south of France fleeing. They hide in an abbot, right, in a monastery, who the Catholic bishop there welcomed the family in, because he was apparently just very welcoming to people who were fleeing during the war. And some of the cities were still being bombed at the time or attacked. And he's hiding this abbot, and he's despondent. He's walking through the library of the abbot, doesn't know what to do or say or even think at this point. He's just so despondent. So he's walking through this gorgeous library, and he happens to come upon an Old Testament, a copy in Latin, in French, excuse me. And he's looking through it, and he starts crying, because he's reading, he goes to Yirmiyahu, he thinks about the tragedy of the Jewish people, and it's brutal. Happens to be the abbey is bombed that night. Thankfully, no one is hurt, but the library is completely destroyed. The next day, he gets up and looks at the wreckage with the abbot and everybody else, and the books are almost all burned, they're all gone, fire consumed them, except for one, Old Testament. And he says to the abbot, you see, like our Torah, the spirit of the Jewish people is not going to be broken by this. We're going to continue on through this. It's a nice story. Whether that happened, I'm not sure, but it essentially goes to the power of his commitment of communal organizing, of his commitment to Judaism. And he brings that commitment when he comes to the United States. So he does, when he comes to the United States, he's able to escape through the south of France. He spent some time in Lisbon for a few months, which was neutral territory, and he is invited to come to New York. Remember what I mentioned about New York? This is a community that there are maybe 20 or 30 different synagogues. It's a huge Sephardic community, robust, Lower East Side, Spanish Harlem, even the Bronx, eventually into Brooklyn and Queens, New York's geography. Each community had a synagogue, one for the synagogue of Rhodes, one for the synagogue of Salonika, one for the synagogue of Monastir, etc. And the community's fighting. Already twice, the community tried to unify under different umbrellas. But there's no character, there's no persuasive individual who has made the case that a Jew from the town of Monastir should care what happens to the Jew from the town of Rhodes. He comes in like gangbusters, so to speak, and he is charismatic as heck. He speaks so many different languages: French, Ladino, Turkish, Greek. He doesn't speak English. This is actually very important, but he speaks the languages of the community. So they assemble, they hear the chief rabbi Paris is coming, they assemble a town hall, and over the local press, the Ladino press, Ovadia, reports over 1,000 people come. Like, it's a big deal. And he makes this incredible impassioned speech about the need for unity, especially at a time when the brethren in Paris and Vienna are under siege, are being attacked. I should make a side note. He leaves Vienna in 1933, and in 1938, unfortunately, the synagogue is destroyed during Kristallnacht. So there is a long history of Sephardic Jews in the city until it's destroyed in one night. I digress. But he gets to work right away. He doesn't skip a beat. It's really incredible. This man just lost his entire community, exiled from his home, almost killed, and he doesn't let him stop, right? He doesn't let himself stop. And he keeps going, pushes and pushes and pushes to unify. So they formed this thing called the Central Sephardic Community of America, whose mission was extraordinary, to basically unify the Sephardic communities in the United States. And it's amazing what you can actually find when you actually do some research. I actually go to the old archives of the Center for Jewish History to find the minute books of this institution, which outlines the goals of the community. And just the highlights of them, for example, they record this in the first meeting. They wanted to establish a rabbinical tribunal, a Bet Din for the American Sephardic community, which, if you know, does not exist and has never actually existed properly. They wanted to reorganize the existing synagogues and Talmudei Torah. So formulate one central Talmud Torah for the community, several central synagogues, because they're spending money left and right. They're using resources for these small little, what you call shtibels, right? Instead of congregating them all in one central place. They want to establish cultural centers for the youth. He was very, very much a proponent of youth engagement. He realized if we're not building youth, then we're not doing anything. We have to define and coordinate the aims and purposes of the social work, right? Social work is really critical right now. Don't forget, this is an immigrant community. Many of them don't speak English. I mentioned before, they are being discriminated against by their Ashkenazi brethren. They're not receiving social services. They're not getting the things they need to establish themselves. They need to cooperate with the local Jewish community, and they need to construct a truly representative Sephardic synagogue, one grand, essentially, minhag. He is a proponent of consolidating the minhagim into one Ladino-speaking Sephardi thing, a big order. But this is bold, right? And he gets the community leadership behind him. So all these different societies agreed to come under the umbrella of this institution, the Central Sephardic Community of America. And this is a big reach, right? This is just to highlight the communications he was already starting in 1940, when he first comes to America. He's communicating with 20 plus synagogues in New York, New Jersey area. He's writing to Los Angeles for the Rhodes synagogue there. He's writing to Montgomery, Alabama. Jews from Rhodes and Turkey go there. He's writing to Atlanta. He's writing to Seattle. And they're writing back. They're communicating. They're saying, we need this. We need a national institution that unites us all, with schools, with yeshivot, with synagogue resources. There was no one, for example, siddur that the community used. The haphazard siddurim they brought for them from Vienna, or they brought them from Salonika, etc. There's no centralization. There's nothing. Should also mention, he argues strenuously for Sephardic Kashrut agency, right? He wants to form this. He wants to do all of this. And I want to show you who this guy was from his speech. He makes a really bold, passionate speech at the first Sephardic World Congress in Vienna. We were able to find this from 1925, which is extraordinary. He makes it in French, so we've got this translated. Here's an excerpt. It's a very long speech. I'm happy to share it with you, but it's a brilliant speech. He says, the Sephardi is a reformist in his ideas, but conservative in his acts. He tries to adapt philosophy to religion. The Sephardim had never attempted to separate Judaism and nationalism. That is why Sephardi Kabbalistic movement differs from the Ashkenazi Hasidic movement. The Sephardi spirit seeks concentration and unification, as is seen in our famous teachers, Alfasi, Rambam, and Karo, who have synthesized Judaism to make it united, lasting. We must reorganize and collect our energies so that we too can take a living part in the progress of Jewish life. European civilization and the history of human thought have taught us that the concerted will of a nation does not know the expression "I cannot." Never take no for an answer guy. I mean, it's really powerful. It's personally powerful to me when I run into these challenges of stubbornness or, we don't want to do this, we don't do that. He said, no, we're doing it. And they describe him as such a persuasive individual that could talk to the elite of the elite, the most intellectual, to the basic person. I mean, his speech was really powerful. He knew his audience, he knew how to engage with them, no matter their level. Unfortunately, like all good things come to an end. Unfortunately, his life was very too quickly cut short. In 1942, as he's working diligently to try to organize the community, he has a heart attack. The doctor says you should slow down, etc. He takes a vacation. He has a second massive heart attack and he dies. He dies at 52 years old, in his prime. And I cannot express how devastating this is to the community. For the first time, they feel like they have a mascot they all can get behind. They have someone who gets them, who's de los muestros, who's one of them, who has the power to unite them, and he's gone. And the eulogies they make are pretty extraordinary. If you see on the right here, this is a eulogy by Albert Matarasso in Ladino. It's in Merubah. So traditionally, Ladino is either written in Merubah Hebrew or in Rashi script. So you can actually read it here. I'm happy to send more of it. They read beautiful eulogies. So here's one example of what they said at the funeral. And thousands of people show up to this funeral. We're talking thousands from the community. Reverend Jeshurun Cardozo, who later becomes an acting chief rabbi and also the rabbi minister at said he was a Sephardic he was in his heart and soul a Sephardi. He loved his Sephardi brothers and sisters. He worked for them without rest, without respite. He could not bear that they did not receive the recognition which is due to them from his peers, right? That they, the descendants of great men and giants of our Sephardic past, were not living up to their reputation. He was Ovadia. He was like a leader, Moshe, and Ovadia, a servant of the Lord. I mean, the testaments to this man were extraordinary. People were crying. The minutes of the Central Sephardic community after the meeting, the first meeting after the meeting, they were lost. They were writing, we don't need to write how devastated we are. We don't know where to go from this. And unfortunately, the community never fully recovered from this, albeit they eventually get another chief rabbi who we'll talk about next week, Rabbi Isaac Alkalai. But I want to point you to, I think, one of the most beautiful tributes he gets in Lavada. Lavada, like I mentioned, was one of the key Ladino language newspapers, one of the last to be printed weekly in America. It shut its doors in, I believe, 1950, 1949. But his widow, Mazal Ovadia, who is also very active, writes a beautiful epitaph. Alas, the ceaseless, tireless, and lifelong striving of my husband for his ideal has ended. He was not given to him to see the realization of his dream, the renaissance of Sephardic Jewry, that spiritual and cultural advancement that would in time enable them to take their proper place in the scope of Jewish activities. I'll mention that he really did want Sephardim to be fully integrated into Jewish life. That's why he served on the executive committee of the Jewish Agency. He helped work with the Joint Distribution Committee to get Jews out of Europe. He really was a community builder in all sense of the word. In this, my hour of deepest sorrow, my fervent prayer to the leaders of the community is that they see to it, the life of my beloved husband dedicated and sacrificed to this cause will not be in vain, and that out of the movement he helped to bring here into being, there may one day emerge the strong, united Sephardic community he had labored for. This as his aim in life, and no greater monument to the memory of the Reverend Dr. Nissim Joseph Ovadia could ever be erected then the cause he so zealously and ardently worked for be continued and brought to fruition for the glory of the Sephardim and Judaism at large. To me, this is the most beautiful, beautiful ask. Don't just cry for him. If you really cared about what he cared for, if you really cared about him, continue this fight. Because otherwise, all he did, what he did for you, was in vain. So this, in many ways, has been my personal guiding star. And unfortunately, this doesn't fully happen. It kind of happens. There is some organization. They unite around a Sephardic old age home, to be talked about next week. They do appoint another chief rabbi. But the community never fully recovers from this devastating loss in its nascent days. And I, in many ways, have tried to embody his message of this idea of being steeped in our tradition, but fully engaged with the world, of engaging people where they're at, and highlighting our Ladino-speaking community, and that we do matter, that our history, our passion, our heritage matters. And he's actually buried in one of our cemeteries in New York. And I took it upon myself a couple of years ago to find his grave, and we found his grave. He's in this older section in Queens. And this is me visiting him during what was our first now annual ziyara to the cemetery during Rosh Hashanah and Kippur, with him in his grave. And it says, in memory of our beloved rabbi and founder, Dr. Nissim J. Ovadia, a tireless worker for the cause of Sephardic Jewry, Central Sephardic Jewry of America. It says his chief rabbis in Vienna, Paris, and New York, and it's also his inscription is also in Ladino. So I'll stop here in a moment, just questions and thoughts and comments, with a quote I love from Ladino, Deshame entrar me azere lugar. Let me enter and I will make a place for myself. And that's, I think, what Rabbi Nissim Ovadia embodied, right? This idea that build it, right? Give me a chance and we're going to make it happen. We're going to build this community that can be robust, that can sustain our identity, that can teach our Torah and mitzvot, that can be a source of strength and pride. And that's my hope, is that we can learn from this and that others will learn from this. And as I continue to do research, and as I hope you all can do research on this amazing man, we learn more, because we only have so many writings for him right now, but we know there's more out there. So with that, I'll close. I'll encourage you all to certainly follow the Sephardic Brotherhood online, to keep in touch. And again, a really big thanks to the whole team at Habura for giving me this opportunity to share the life and legacy of Rabbi Dr. Nissim Ovadia with you.
Thank you so much, Ethan. That was not only very interesting, but also very empowering and inspiring. If anyone has any questions, comments, severe criticisms, they can unmute, raise their hand, or write in the chat box. Avi.
Sure. Ethan, that was excellent. Thank you. Really informative. And I'd heard the name, but I really didn't know much about him. So thank you for that. Just a question that comes up, really. I mean, I guess he wasn't long in America, so there was limited time, limited impact he could have had, apart from maybe setting the stage. But were there any, at least schools? I mean, I doubt there were any like yeshivot, but were there any institutions that he helped establish? I saw that was one of the goals. And maybe if not while he was alive, but maybe like immediately after, right? Just in that post-war period, or before the war, I guess, and then after as well. Yeah.
Great question. So right, he dies during the war, right? He dies in 1942, right? So he gets there late 1940, 1941. He only really has a year, like I've mentioned. But he does establish institutions, right? The Central Sephardic community is the main umbrella. And he works to start getting several Talmudei Torah up and running and united. There were different hubs in New York by that time for the Sephardic community. The Lower East Side was still a big hub, but already people had started migrating out of the Lower East Side to places like Spanish Harlem in Upper Manhattan, and places like the Bronx, and in Brooklyn, in areas like New Lots, which I'm sure people here, I know Jake certainly knows this kind of stuff as well. And they start establishing small little Talmudei Torah in different communities, right? But they don't really coordinate. Each synagogue has its own, etc. So after him, you start getting some unification. In the 1950s, you have the United Sephardim of Brooklyn form, and they form their own United Sephardic Talmud Torah, albeit it's multiple days a week, but it's still not a school, right? No one ever builds a school. This is one of the biggest failings of our communities, right? We didn't build schools. We faced intense discrimination, and this is going to be part 2 of my series. We'll talk about it next week. They also wanted to be American Jews. What did American Jews mean at the time? It meant conservative Ashkenazi Jews in the 1950s and 60s. We'll talk about what that means demographically next week. But aside from the Central Sephardic community, he does also form an association of American Sephardic communities. I forgot to mention this. Remember that global international Sephardi idea I mentioned? He's writing to Lima, Peru. He's writing to Brazil. He's writing to Buenos Aires. He's writing to Mexico City. He's writing to all these Greek and Turkish communities, and they're writing back and they're corresponding to coordinate, again, building of yeshiva where they can send their students, either New York or Israel, to help coordinate and see what needs these communities have, right? Let's not just go blindly here. Let's ask these communities, what do you need to sustain yourself? He was very much a strategic thinker and very much a community organizer in that sense.
Did he ever attempt to work with the Ashkenazim as well, or was he very much Sephardi focused and that's it?
Right, he did. So as I mentioned previously, he was very active in the Zionist movement as well. He was on the executive committee of the Sochnut, of the agency, so we knew people like Chaim Weissman and Ben Gurion, and they knew him. So it's not like he's just some obscure figure. He was very involved in Zionism, Zionist activity. And he did work as well in New York. Specifically, we have some documentation to show that he worked with what was called then the United Jewish Philanthropies of New York, which later became the UJ Federation of New York. He did work with them to try to get more social workers established. He worked with HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which was trying to get Jews out of Europe. And he worked with the American Joint Distribution Committee as well. He served on their executive committee, I think, for a brief period. Again, he passed away soon after, as well. He did believe in global Jewry, right? He believed that we were all brothers and sisters, albeit his focus was first elevating the status of the Sephardim, because he knew they were just so mistreated and frankly under-resourced that he needed to do something now before they lost themselves forever.
I have a question from Elisheva in the chat. What was in general the level of education of the Jews coming from the Ottoman Empire compared with the Ashkenazi community they encountered in the lower east side of New York?
It's a great question. Mixed, I would say, just like the Ashkenazim of the Lower East Side, right? There was no monolith necessarily, right? You had people, like I mentioned, Alberto Amato, who went to university, studied law. They were the elites, obviously. People like this gentleman, Henry J. Pariah, who was from Salonika, who became a founder of the Brotherhood later on, the Sephardic Brotherhood of America. They were well educated, they were businessmen, but there were also a lot of poor people, a lot of people who were lower income, first generation, working to make a buck, right? So you have this constant extreme like you do in any Ashkenazi community. The difference with the Sephardim versus Ashkenazim is that they estimate, demographers are not really sure how many Sephardim come to America in the 20th century. They estimate from very, very loose estimates, roughly 100,000 Jews come from the Ottoman Empire at the time, but we're talking over 1 million Ashkenazim come, right? So the portion is much bigger, right? So that in itself makes a difference. And by the way, the existing Jews in New York, when the Hungarians and the Romanians, and the Polish and the Russians come, aren't exactly fans of those either. The two existing communities of the Spanish and Portuguese uptown, and the German, the Yeki Jews who come in the 1920s. And they look very, very down on the Ashkenazim from Poland and from Eastern Europe as well. They make them look bad. They don't want that. So they have to deal with this wrangling as well within the Ashkenazi community, albeit less severe than how they dealt with the Sephardic community, which is just, shoving them off.
I have a question from Maya. Why is there so much coverage in the Pittsburgh Press, which is not a Jewish paper, of the Jewish community? Our in-house reporter.
That's a great question, Maya. I have absolutely no idea. I'm pretty sure this article I pulled up online from a couple of databases on press publications. I'm pretty sure this was a syndicated article published by a Jewish syndicated, wire service. I'm not exactly sure which one. It might have been JTA, but I haven't found it on JTA's site. And I'm not really sure why a local press like the Pittsburgh Press would pick it up.
You mentioned a little bit, he spoke about sort of the intellectual character traits of the Sephardim. Did he write a lot about that? Or was he mainly focused a lot on sort of defending the more ethnic definition of Sephardim, meaning people who actually came from that area?
Yeah, I mean, he really did believe in the intellectual Sephardic tradition. He believes in the glory of the Sephardic identity and the way it viewed Judaism. Albeit we don't have so many writings and we don't know how much more is out there. But he wrote extensively, for example, we know for a fact in the 20s and 30s, he wrote extensively in believe it was Le Mondial Sephard, right? It was like the Global Sephardi. It was a French publication in the 20s and 30s. It was an intellectual journal published by the World Sephardic Federation that he had found about intellectual tradition. He wrote about Torah. He wrote about kind of ideas of living a Jewish life. So we know he wrote there extensively. I haven't been able to find many articles. I found 1 or 2 citations. It's very hard to source, unfortunately, which is something I hope to change one day, maybe with a Habura journal publication, who knows?
Avi asks, can you talk about the Solapur role in welcoming the Ottoman Jews? Did he have a relationship with Rabbi Nissim Ovadia?
Great question. So yes, he was deeply involved in the arrival of Ottoman Sephardim starting in the teens, right? So this can be a whole another lecture into itself, but the Sephardic Jews, when they come to New York and the US in general, starting the 1900s, the 19-teens, they look to their landsmen, right, so to speak, right, their commonality, and the closest one was the S&P Sephardi community, Sherith Israel, who do help them, right? Sherith Israel becomes a founding institution of the Central Sephardic community, and they also establish what are called settlement houses, right, on the Lower East Side. These are homes that people will go to initially settle in for the first 6 months. They have boarding houses, they have night classes. They also, the women's division of Sherith Israel, the sisterhood of Sherith Israel, establishes one of the key synagogues on the Lower East Side, congregation Bet El, which is a Salonican synagogue, was sponsored by them, for example. The Solapur is at the opening of many of these synagogues, right? Famously, my synagogue, he's at the opening in 1927. But there are also tensions, right? For example, the S&P Spanish and Portuguese community don't want these Jews to call them Sephardim because it's going to make those Sephardim look bad, right? Remember this tension I talked about, right? So they want them to be Oriental Jews, which many of the Sephardim already saw as a derogatory term and pushed back on because they want this collective identity. Like, no, editors of Rambam, of Nachmanides, of Ibn Ezra, of these great people, right? Gedalicia, for example, the man I quoted before, was of this opinion that we shouldn't take the term Oriental, but they kind of acquiesce, they kind of don't. It's still a debated topic, and there is some evidence to show that many in the S&P were not exactly thrilled with supporting these people, but thankfully some of the other, leadership won out in sense of coordinating. The Solapur in particular also was a chaplain essentially for the Central Sephardic community, and on the rabbinical committee. There was a rabbinical committee of several rabbis, including the chief rabbi of the Syrian community at the time. I think it was either Rabbi Kassim, the elder, or there was another one, I'm forgetting at the moment off the top of my head, who was also very involved in the community organizing. I see that Jake mentions another gentleman, Nissim Bahar, who, if anybody knows him, was like the Sephardi extraordinaire at the time to try to coax young men to go to school, go learn. He was a very, 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 very big proponent of education. He was also an advocate of the arts. And then he goes to Israel and does the exact same thing for the Sephardim also, and helps build yeshivot in schools as well to the day he dies. By the way, this man, Nissim Bahar, Rabbi Nissim Bahar, was also on the committee to revitalize the Hebrew language. He was one of the biggest advocates to use Hebrew as the principal language in Israel, worked with Ben Yehuda, for example. Sorry, I know I'm jumping around a lot, but they're important figures.
Lisheva asks, well, were there many newspapers in Ladino at that time in the US?
There were a ton. The press was very, very robust at the turn of the teens and the 20s. There were papers like La America, La Luz, La Vala, La Bloz de Pueblo. There were at least a dozen papers at the peak. We would say probably at least a dozen. Not all of them lasted very long. The one that lasts the longest is La Vara, because they're able to be financially sustained from subscriptions, and it was pretty broad in depth. It lasts for about 25 years, ends in around 1949, 1950. And it also is one of the only papers that reports on news outside of New York. It has correspondence from Seattle, California, Florida, Latin America. I actually found an article from Levada, and it's all digitized. The National Library of Israel, Hebrew University of Jerusalem, did a major digitization project. You can find all the copies of Levada now online. It's extraordinary. And they're all initially in Ladino with Merubah, the Ladino with Latin characters, and then English. You can see the transition of the immigrant community to English. But there was a robust press, and they're debating many critical issues of the day. Should the community unite? What's the deal with only, separate seeing for men and women? They were talking about that then because they were seeing stuff from the Ashkenazim. What's the deal with a Siddur? Should we have a monastili synagogue and a Salonican synagogue? Should we only talk in Ladino? Should our kids go to public school or have a school, right? A lot of critical issues. Even people running for political office. In fact, there was we believe the first elected Sephardi to American US office was a New York State senator in 1924. I'm getting his name off the top of my head. He was elected by the community on the Lower East Side to state office, to state senate. And yes, I see a lot of chats. Everybody should check out the La Gente, the People. That's the community magazine of the Sephardic Brotherhood, which we now do publish both in English and Ladino. So we're trying to make sure the next generation gets to learn and connect.
Any other questions?
Definitely come back for next week's. It's part 2,
Yes.
right? This is not the only one as well. There's a lot more coming. So I hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to share some wisdom from Rabbi Ovadia.
Amazing. So stay tuned, everyone. Next week, hope to see everyone back with more friends. And thank you so much, Ethan. It was an incredible shiur, and everyone's excited for the next one. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Laila tov.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Bye. Good night.